Normally during this time of year, I talk about the global moment. I talk about the things that are right on top of my mind. 2020, this year, one of the things that is central is the pandemic, is social distancing, this whole idea of being disrupted. This is a very disruptive year. Things are changing. We have to stay at home. We can't do things the way that we had done in previous years. And unquestionably, everyone has had some form of disruption right now. The fact that you're watching this on a screen instead of in person is just one example of the disruption that we're experiencing this year. So I took a lot of pictures. I took about 5,000 pictures this year. And one of the pictures that I really wanted to take and I really wanted to capture and thought would be very interesting was me getting a COVID test. And I'm not sure how many people watching right now had a COVID test already, but it was a very common experience. There were hundreds of millions of these tests carried out over the globe this year, and I was just one of them. And it was a common form of disruption. This was a really disruptive thing. I was going to go to a wedding of one of my childhood friends. One of the rules about attending the wedding, there was a small wedding with just 10 people, but it's still, we all got to go get COVID tests. We're not going to make this a bad situation. We're going to make this a very pleasant situation for everybody and something that's going to be positive and can remember in this very great light. So I go to Umos, which is on the south side of Milwaukee. It's right across the street from Usinger Hot Dogs, and there's a huge line organized by a bunch of National Guard reserve troops. And most of these guys are in their 20s. They're 20-year-old guys that signed up to go fight wars, to go be soldiers, to go save the world in some way. And they get enlisted to stick cotton swabs up people's noses for weeks on end. And this is how they're going to save the world. So it's this really bizarre thing. There's about 30, 40 cars just circling in and out of this huge parking lot for the 10, 15 minutes I'm there. It's almost no contact. This is the only time anybody ever came in contact with me. Every other time, everything else was done on the phone. And you can see here, I didn't take this picture. My partner took this picture, and you can see me looking right in the eyes of this National Guard trooper. And I was it was really weird. As he stuck up this thing up my nose, I sort of had a moment of clarity, like, oh, of course this was going to happen. I just sort of thought that there, like, of course, this weird, horribly physically disruptive thing, this socially disruptive thing, I hope I never have anybody put anything up my nose ever again like this. And it's sort of a break of decorum, a breach of decorum, a breach of social standards. It's a whole new social process. It all sort of made sense for me. And relating this to 2020 vision, I think the year 2020 had a lot of these moments of clarity, these moments where when they happened, they made sense. Like, oh, of course this was going to happen. Maybe we couldn't have predicted them beforehand, but looking at them from the past, we can see them as something that were almost inevitable. And so how can we sort of frame 2020 in this idea of disruption, this idea of having foresight, this idea of being able to conceptualize and experience this very disruptive year that we have? There's a cultural evolutionist named Peter Churchin, and in 2010, he talked about a looming instability and a turning point that would happen in 2020. And he's an anthropologist, but he bases a lot of his ideas more on statistics than on cultural observation, like I would. He's going and looking at the data. And he's seeing these long-term cycles between 40 and 60 years. And he was seeing that 2020 was going to be a cycle of decline, moment when things were going to sort of break down and new things were going to start to happen. He was basing it off of the idea of the Kondrativ or Kondrativ curve. We have the two spellings there. A Russian sociologist in the 1930s. He was a Soviet communist looking at long-term stability and instability in the economy. And here we have just one example. In 1837, he can track this back to 1837. There's been more recent studies that have taken this all the way back to the 9th century in China. China's been a really good bureaucratic state. And so we can see that a lot of the economic markers that they were tracking could also be sort of transposed onto these curves. And we can see here there's ups and downs, mountains and valleys. And what Churchill and Kondratev are seeing is the growing or the diminishing of opportunity, economic opportunity, and social opportunity, the growing or diminishing of social freedoms, and then the growing or the diminishing of inequality. And they measure this in a bunch of different ways. We can measure this based off of income, off of educational access, off of political enfranchisement. But every statistician is going to really engage this in their own specific way. But what we see then here leading into the 2010s, we sort of see this opportunity for a big dip happening over here. And Churchill and Kondratev sort of predicted this. They were seeing this happen in many different ways. And what are some of the effects we can see? And these are just going to be things that we can actually identify right now in our current moment. All these different technological advancements that we're having right now. And it might not seem like an advancement because we've had a lot of this technology in our life, but the fact that we are mediating our whole life on technology right now, on computer screens, on Facebook, on cell phones. I'm not even sure how many people are using their cell phone to listen to this right now. The fact that we're doing that, that's very innovative. And that's sort of an advancement. We shifted the technology that our economy is based around to this very visually mediated, computer mediated economy that doesn't require us to go to a place to work, go to a place of education, and we can do things at home now. So we've shifted our technological function, and I don't think, and this is just me being predictive, I don't think it's going to change back that easily. And we're going to probably have in-person classes eventually, and we're probably going to go back to a lot of in-person work, but we're going to see everyone sort of out of that now. And I don't think anybody really wants to go back. I think we all want to sort of have some elements of this work really well for us, and we want to sort of keep it. We can also see birth rates and birth rates going up and going down. We're sort of in, I believe we're in a baby boom right now, but it sort of ended a few years ago. So we're having this big boom of people in the United States and across the world. But we can see that as the economic opportunities have sort of contracted, people have sort of hit middle classness, and they don't want to necessarily stress out about having families with 10 kids, and they might be happy with 2. We start seeing that birth rates are sort of leveling out and declining. And we can even see this in Japan, where the population is declining. In 50 years, it's going to have like 50 million less people or something than it does now. Just to think a country as large as China, as Japan, is shrinking is crazy. And China is also remaining a little stable in terms of their population level, and they're trying to get people to make more babies. So really, we're at a point where the world is not growing as fast as what it once was, even a decade ago. And then we see a rise in revolutions and populism. And we might not see a lot of overt revolutions right now at the moment, but we definitely do see a rise in populism. One of the big examples of a populist dictator or regime would be if we looked at like Putin, for example. He's a populist. We also see he's not a dictator, but he's definitely a populist. Is Donald Trump, who's still in power right now as of 2 weeks after the election, and he will be up until next year. But he was a populist. He more or less was appealing to the everyman, and that's what populism means, appealing to the everyman. And as he was doing this, he was trying to appeal to those people who felt excluded from the economy, who felt disenfranchised by the elites. And this was a direct result of the growing divide and growing inequality between individuals. And this is something that's really problematic, and something that I'll just sort of frame this in Gen Z going forward. We see that Gen Z is going to be behind millennials in terms of economic advancement within their life, specifically because of this moment in time, specifically because of all the economic consequences of 2020. And millennials are years behind the other generations that are predating them. So I consider myself a millennial. And if you look at the economic opportunity and the economic wealth that people my age have accumulated at this point in their lives, it is so much lower than baby boomers, which would be my parents' generation, as well as Generation X, which might be your parents' generation. So we see that there is a growing generational divide in terms of economic distribution. And it's not like the United States or the world's getting poorer. It just means that there is more money and more resources filtering to one group of individuals. So we see this pattern sort of coalescing in 2020. 2020 is not the most chaotic year, the most disruptive year. We can really say that is 536 AD. This was the first year that the Byzantine Empire experienced a plague. And we can see a lot of parallels to what happened in the United States this year, happening in 536 AD in the Byzantine Empire. At the time, this was the remnants of the Roman Empire. It was the Eastern Roman Empire broke off from the West right after this happened. Right after this, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire was more or less closing his court off to people and becoming incredibly more isolated from even the nobility and even other sort of regions in the empire that he had. And this caused him not to react to the encroachment of the Black Death, which is pretty much the same plague that took over Europe about 500 years later, killed about 1/4 of the population. We see that he sort of ignores this from happening until it gets to his court, until it gets to affect him. And he actually gets it. And after this, he starts instituting reforms. But by this point, this is about a year into the pandemic, we see that the enemies of the Byzantine Empire start encroaching on their territory, start trying to chip away at their sovereignty, start trying to sort of weaken them. And combined with this, just coincidentally, and this is something that's really in line with 2020, we see that there's a bunch of things that aren't political, that things we couldn't really prevent, or things that were just going to happen. So we have this idea of being conscious of the things that we do and the reactions that we have to this, but also things that we have no control over. And what happens during this year as well, and around this year, we see two major eruptions, one in Iceland, one in Indonesia. So two different parts of the world, major volcanic eruptions that coat the sky in soot, cause a mini ice age. And Europe and the world doesn't really recuperate economically for another 100 years. And so we see that many people think that this is probably the worst year in history. 2020 doesn't really have much to hold a candle to hold a light to compared to this year. Many more people, or just as many people, were killed. We see the same type of growing instability, a lot of destruction, political regimes were broken down. So what do I do? How can I take these sort of ideas of a disruptive year, of cycles of growth and decline? How can I apply that to my ethnographic perspective, my participant observation, when I go around and I make these casual observations about me going and getting a test, for example? I found some really interesting ideas, and one is from the first African-American anthropologist that really came to fame and drew a lot of attention. There might have been African-American anthropologists and sociologists before this. There were, for sure, undoubtedly, I should say. But this was the first female woman anthropologist, African-American anthropologist, that really rose to fame in our field, Zora Neale Hurston. And one of her big books is Their Eyes Were Watching God. And when I was sort of brainstorming this disruptive year over the last year, and I've been working on this for the last year, I encountered this one little quote, and I really thought it was a great way to frame the question about how disruption works and how a year can be disruptive, how a year can have a social personality, how it can almost be a person and have a personality that we can all identify. Like 2020 is disruptive. Maybe 2010 was fun, right? But 2020 was disruptive, and that is their personality. They have a disruptive personality. 2020 has a disruptive personality. So seeing the year as a person, we can see this quote from Zora Neale Hurston that is just beautiful. She's a beautiful writer. There are years that ask questions and years that answer. So what I can then say in terms of my research based off of this year, trying to understand the personality of this year, I can ask, what questions does this year ask? And what questions does it answer? What challenges does it present us? And what kind of looming social doubts did it really give us clear perspective on? And then there's this other more theoretical perspective that we can use, a lot more theoretical. So that's a set of questions we can use. We can personify a year. And then we have Jacques Derrida, who was a French sociologist, and he uses the idea of a chronotype. So we have a watch that we can use and see seconds tick away and minutes tick away. But then we can also think about, how long it takes to cook a meal. That's a different concept of time. How long it takes to finish a college degree. That's a different set of time. It might say 4 years on average, but we all know that looking out on your education, that's a different concept of time than what is dictated by a calendar. So 2020 really gave a unique chronotype, really gave this unique sense of time, rhythm, sentiment, and importance. All right, so this is a picture I took. This is the first picture I took this year, and it's Mad Max. If you don't know what Mad Max is, it's this post-apocalyptic movie, takes place in the desert in Australia in the 1980s, and more or less it's the end of the world. Mel Gibson has this really cool car, and he's more or less a superhero empowered by his car in this post-apocalyptic place, and he sort of gets all the bad guys and stuff. I took this picture in Cabo Frio on New Year's Day 2020. It's the first picture I took. I was going to the beach, going to go swim in the beach in the morning, and I saw this, and I'm just like, oh, wow, I'm going to take a picture of this really cool dune buggy that this guy has parked outside his beach shack. And at the time, I didn't really recognize it. Like, I sort of thought it was funny and stuff. And I even looked at my Facebook post. I put this on Facebook right away, and I was like, oh, here comes 2020. And I didn't do it intentionally. I didn't want to say that there was actually going to be these apocalyptic things happening, that there was going to be a pandemic, that there was going to be disruption, that there was going to be all these horrible things that we experienced this year, civil unrest, things like that. But how can I see this as a piece of ethnographic data, of sociological data then? This idea of foresight, this idea of giving 2020 a quality, this idea of analyzing the disruption that we have in society. And so one thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to show you a few other photos that I want you to really discuss with me afterwards, but give me comments on and things like that. But I see that there's a lot of collateral thinking happening this year, that we have not just our first interpretation of disruption, but we also develop this idea of consequence. We also develop this idea of introspection and clarity. So we can analyze moments where we create secondary thoughts. We can also look at this idea of patchwork ethnography, and this is sort of a contemporary idea that we have in anthropology, where we talk about getting ethnographic data from a bunch of different places. Our modern world produces a whole bunch of different types of ideas and experiences, and we should be able to embrace those variety of experiences. So I'm going to be presenting a number of different types of images from a bunch of different types of cameras, but also of a bunch of different types of social settings. And I'm going to try to unite them. And I believe all of these images are united by the same common themes that I will be presenting. And then we have the idea of visual ethnography, just using visual methods as a way of understanding culture. And I'll just give you a little bit of background. Cabo Frio, this small city, it's just north of Rio de Janeiro, beautiful beach town. It was one of the first towns in Brazil. It was a place where we see indigenous genocide play out in Brazil. And this happened between Portuguese and French colonizers who were really trying to dominate the trades in this area. And we see that they wipe out a bunch of Native Americans in this place. So there's an apocalypse that happens around 1500 in Cabo Frio. This place is built over a genocide, over a indigenous apocalypse. We fast forward to the 1990s, and we see that a bunch of different environmental regulations close down this salt flat processing center that really saved the town, that really sort of bolstered industry in the town, and it closes down and the town shifts to be a tourist center. Well, in 2020, the economy in Brazil was collapsing, and more or less these tourist things that people were doing, no one had money for. And so no one was going to this little small town. And so it sort of felt like the town was dying a little bit. And all of these things sort of make sense now that I see 2020 as being disruptive, that I see this year as being a year of instability. When I look at this image, it just symbolically makes so much sense. This is another image. This isn't my image, but just to sort of foreground a lot of this stuff, I would be errant not to say that COVID dominated this year. This is from the middle of the year. This is just a map reflecting by the numbers, the sheer numbers. If the population or the size of these countries was based off the number of new cases of COVID in July, we see that the United States, Brazil, and India are the leaders. South Africa is there. Middle East is looking pretty bad, and Western Europe's looking pretty bad. I guarantee you a lot of these numbers are probably very similar today, a few months later, but we can see that this is another way to visually assess what's going on, a very specific map. This is another way to represent the COVID pandemic, the type of things that would become ultimately definitive of our social experience of this year. And this is in Manaus. This is a town up in Amazonia, the largest city in Amazonia. And they had a huge problem with COVID, and they had to build mass graves. And so this was something that the mayor of Manaus wanted to share with the world. He's like, hey, we need help, and the world needs help. And this is no joke. Everyone's dying. So this is a very specific, and this isn't my image. This is an image I pulled off the internet. But this is a just one other way that we can see visually representing disruption, the disruption of death. I experienced death in many different ways this year. I had an aunt who passed away recently. I had a neighbor in my neighborhood I moved to about 3 years ago, and he was one of the first guys to really embraced me. Had a dog. We had a dog. We walked, we talked, all that kind of stuff. Just died of a heroin overdose a few weeks ago. And then I had this gentleman, Arlindo, who was sort of like an uncle to me when I was doing my research in Brazil, my dissertation research. And he was this strong guy. I lived with him. He would always be fixing stuff, very virile. He lived a very active life. And he was someone who moved from this very impoverished neighborhood, this very impoverished region in Brazil, to Rio de Janeiro. And he sort of was living this Brazilian dream of being successful. You know, he was hanging out with a bunch of foreigners all day, so he's very cosmopolitan. And he had this very international lifestyle as well. But the one thing he showed me first, when I first ever met him, was an image of himself in the 1960s or 70s in this small town. And it was him on top of a horseback, on horseback, riding through this small town. And that's how he wanted me to know him, and how he wanted me to remember him, and how he wanted me to think of him while he was living as well, like as this guy on top of a horseback. And this is really what he embodied when I knew him. He was the guy that was always ready to lift something or do something, make something. He was always there, and he was always talking about retiring. He ended up retiring in 2019, and he almost immediately got sick. And he never told me what he had, but he just sort of slowly wasted away. And there's an idea that it was cancer, it could have been AIDS, but he never wanted to tell me. And I don't know how he would have gotten any of those diseases or anything like that. He wanted to keep it private. And I sort of never asked. I never confirmed. So I don't know exactly what he died from. But when I was in Brazil in January 2020, I took a lot of pictures of him. And more or less, he would wake up every day and he would go sit on the ground on this tile floor, and he would have like a really thin mattress. He'd wake up at like 5 or 6 in the morning, couldn't sleep, and he would wake up and he'd just stare at the wall in this tiled floor. And I took pictures of him. You know, it was sort of something I do. I take a lot of pictures. And I realized while I was compiling this year of images, I couldn't share that image of him on the ground. It contrasted so much with that image of him on the horseback. So instead, this is an image I took of him 4 years before 2020. It's where he was sort of still filled with strength, still sort of vital, and had all that sort of vitality in life. But one of the reasons why I'm showing you this is that even though I don't know many people who were affected directly by COVID or died from COVID, most of the people who died in my life died from other things. My aunt died from cancer, my neighbor from the heroin overdose, and Arlindo definitely not from COVID. He was sick long before COVID hit Brazil. I can empathize with death, and I see this as a ubiquitous experience of 2020. This is a common experience that we all had in 2020, whether or not we were directly affected by it or we had the secondary effect from it. And so as I talk about these other issues of 2020, this is sort of the thing that looms over the most. This is sort of the thing that permeates all of my discussion in 2020. It was a very deadly year. It was disruptive because it was deadly. And okay, so what happened once the pandemic was declared, once we had to start doing social distancing, once people around us started to pass away? We all went inside and we all started locking ourselves in home and really struggled with that idea of being people trapped inside of our residence and not being able to have this very public life. And there's a bunch of different things that happen when your life is disrupted like that. And I can imagine any of these very disruptive years, people are going through the same idea of being alone with their family, of having to reassess a lot of the issues that are in their lives, a lot of the things that they still have that didn't go away. And so I relate this to taking stock and being in solitude, really just sort of being within oneself, taking stock of the things you have in terms of your social world, but also taking stock of the things you have in your material world. This is an image taken on a Polaroid Spectra here on the screen. I have the word typed out here. They don't make this film anymore. This was actually one of the last images I took of a Polaroid Spectra film, and it's sort of this big Polaroid instant camera. They stopped making it more or less because the film format was too big for the machines that it was producing, and they kept on getting clogged, and so no one wanted to use them. I ended up having like 30 or 40 of these. I used to collect them. I was collecting them and reselling them during my final years in grad school as a way to get income. And so while I was taking stock in my home, I was like, well, I'm going to clean out my home and I'm going to try to get as much money and economic resources saved in this time of possible crisis, of economic crisis. I need to develop a war chest to make sure that I'm saved. And so, I live in this home. It's this old home that I've really reclaimed from the foreclosed owners that had it before. It was sort of cosmetically broken down, a lot of infrastructure in the house broken down, 1920s home. And then we filled it up with all these antiques. And this is my partner, Maria. She does not like this image. And I had to convince her to let me share it with the world. She is treating her hair. She's doing a hair treatment. She didn't have time to do it because she kept on going out, and she didn't want to do anything disruptive to her hair because it took a few hours, and she never had the time to do it. But with the pandemic, she did. And also, we spent a lot of time together. We learned a lot about each other, and I believe almost anybody who went through this pandemic learned a lot about who they live with, their family, those individuals who they're closest with, their roommates, even things like that. So I learned a lot about Maria. I took a lot of stock in my relationship with her, and I really tried to amplify it and improve it. I really took stock in this sort of physical, technology that was sort of dying, and like, how can I make the best of it? And one of the good things about this technology is, especially during the pandemic, you have to be about 6 feet away from people. And that was the main rule for social distancing. So I ended up taking about 80 Spectra photos throughout the year. And this was just one of my favorite. I felt like it looked a lot like an anthropology photo, how it was staged. And she's sitting sort of on this old couch. It's like 1850s couch that she redid. And it just sort of looks, she's got like a crown on and stuff. So it's very, very dynamic and interesting image, even though it might be a little washed out and it might not be as clear as others. I also see a lot of anxiety. One of the first things I did getting out of the house was I was doing all these participant observations of protests, a lot of car protests, people honking, going around buildings like jails and city halls and just honking and waving signs and stuff. This was the first protest here on the screen that I was in person and on the ground. I was wearing a mask. It was a reopen protest. So it was, just to talk about the politics of it. There was definitely some specific politics around this. It was pro-Trump, conservative, aligned with the Republican Party of Wisconsin, and they were complaining about the Governor Tony Evers. He had a mask mandate, and they were out at Brookfield Square, this mall I used to work at when I was a kid, and they were along the road. The mall was dead, no one in the parking lot. These were the only people really on the street, and they were more or less waving signs trying to protest the mask mandate. They were experiencing great deals of anxiety, and I think we all are aware of some of the arguments that they brought up in terms of businesses closing down, people not being able to work, things like that. Depoliticizing what they're saying, we can identify that anxiety that was really common in everybody during this year. We all had forms of anxiety. Part of taking stock, part of going into solitude produces anxiety. And so this guy was one guy who really liked to play up on this anxiety, and I don't like him. So I'll tell you why. I was going to this protest. I was obviously someone who was sort of a third party. I wasn't trying to steal images of anybody. I was asking people permission to take images and stuff like that. So I was trying to be as ethical and responsible in terms of a visual anthropologist as possible. This guy came up behind me and gave me a bear hug. And this was, during the height of COVID. This was actually just after a woman, a 50-year-old woman, came up to me and pretended to cough on me and said she had COVID. And, she was obviously just trying to mess with me, play with my anxiety. And then this guy came up and bear hugged me from behind and then said, "Hey, what's up, man? What are you doing? You should take a picture of me." And he touched me, right? And even without COVID, I don't want random people bear hugging me from behind. So I'm like, okay, man, I'm taking a picture of you. And I'm going to talk poorly about you. So, we don't see his face or anything. I never got his name, but he said I could take a picture of him. So, maybe we'll have, we can have some other discussions later on in terms of my permission to use this. But we can see that he is sort of embodying some of these anxieties. We see it's very highly politicized. And most of these protests, whether you were pro-Trump, anti-Trump, liberal, conservative, highly politicized protests too. So that just sort of gives an idea of 2020, how this anxiety, this disruptive anxiety evolved. This is a screenshot. Once again, this sort of computer mediation. I think this idea of a screenshot is really important. This is a very similar screen and background to what I have right now. This is my office at home. It's the first day of a class that I teach for the University of Colorado entitled Police and Democratic States. And more or less, I look at the anthropology of policing and I see how it relates to protesting. The class started the Monday after George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis after having an interaction with police that went south, and he more or less got suffocated and had an anxiety attack and died. And so, this erupted into massive protests throughout the United States. Milwaukee, where I was no different. And I had just spent the weekend going to all these protests and realizing that the class I had been developing over the last 6 months didn't make any sense anymore. But it also made a lot more sense than it did over the last 6 months. So I'm here frustrated. I'm really tired after marching, feeling all these emotions, hearing all these emotions from individuals. And then also the fact that my class makes a lot more sense and I have to make it better now. I have to really improve it. So I think this is something that happens with disruption. When you have this disruptive year, you go through these solitudes, these taking stock, these anxieties, and we all reach sort of this moment of clarity. Things make sense. We sort of can see the systems that operate in our lives a lot clearer once they're laid bare. One of the ways that this is experienced more collectively is that we all went to the streets and we all protested. This is Giannis Antetokounmpo, the MVP of the NBA this year. He was and his team, the Bucks, were the first team that went on strike and went out and marched in June. They were the people who started the protest movement in sports in June 2020. And so I was there when they first came out. They were right near my neighborhood, and I was able to go out and walk along with them. There were a member 2 years earlier, Sterling Brown, and I believe this is Sterling Brown. Compared him to other pictures, I can't tell because it's behind and everybody's wearing the same outfits. But Sterling Brown was a rookie in 2018. He got tased by Milwaukee police officers. Just recently, in the last few weeks, he was offered $750,000 from the city attorney to sort of drop the charges that he's raising against Milwaukee, and he's probably going to refuse those charges. And what did he do? He was a rookie at the time. The whole town, the whole team, I should say, rallied around him, and they really found a common identity. They developed a sense of solidarity around this common experience that he had. And if we look at Giannis, Giannis is a Greek man who was born in a family of refugees who were not given Greek citizenship. So Giannis never had Greek citizenship until he moved to the United States to be a professional basketball player. So he lived in this town, Athens. You might have heard about it. And Athens is the same size as Milwaukee population-wise. And it has a lot of the same sort of economic inequality problems. And Giannis grew up in an immigrant section in town. If you see images of it, you can tell there's a lot of concrete. It doesn't seem like this very romanticized part of Athens with all the history and stuff like that you see in other places. It's definitely a place that is underserved, underprivileged, and a place that Giannis uses to reflect upon all the inequality in Milwaukee. And so you see him speaking out about a lot of different social issues in Milwaukee in this very impassioned way. And I think this demonstrates really well how we have been able to use 2020 to reflect on our shared critiques of the world, our shared anxieties, our shared sense of social structure and social order. And this image for me really sort of represents this. You know, he's wearing even an I Can't Breathe shirt, something that is related to a bunch of different issues in the Black Lives Matter movement, but most recently this movement in Minneapolis stemming from George Floyd. And if we fast forward just a few weeks later, after the Kenosha unrest, which I'll bring up here in a second, after the Kenosha unrest, we also see that in the middle of the playoffs, Giannis and the Bucks go on strike. And they once again seek to use the idea of disruption to prove a social critique, to demonstrate a sense of commonality after there had been another example of police violence used against an African-American man. This is another example. My parents worked for the post office, and one of the sort of underlying political currents of this year was that Donald Trump was conspiring to limit the access to the postal service, and this would have disrupted mail-in ballots. This might have proved to be a little bit conspiratorial, but nonetheless, there was a very highly circulated image online of thousands of defunct post office boxes sitting in Hartford, Wisconsin. So I'm only about 20, 30 minutes away from Hartford, Wisconsin. I'm like, I'm going to go take my own pictures of this. So I got about 3 or 4 dozen pictures. This is the one that a lot of my classmates or my students really liked. So I picked this one as the highlight. And this one just shows, you know, sort of the chaos and the disruption that took place during the year. Not only our chaos in infrastructure, but also in our dissemination of information. I did a little bit more digging into this business that had all these post office boxes, and they have for years been stripping down these boxes of all their paint and then re-powder coating them so they go back out into circulation. So these guys just had a huge influx of renovating these post office boxes. They weren't conspiring to pull things off the street to stop the vote, to things like that. And my parents are postal workers, and they have been experiencing these type of disruptions their whole lives. So it was really interesting for me to talk to them about this. They were like, no, that's just like what the post office does. That's not like the conspiracy theory. But what it revealed to me when I was talking to them about this was that their whole careers at the post office had been defined by disruption. The post office has been shrinking. Private mail carriers and private parcel delivery has been really sucking away a lot of the resources and income for the post office. So we see just the contraction of this American institution, this American service institution. My parents working for the post office were service members, maybe not military members. My dad was in the military, but these weren't necessarily equated to the sacrifice of military members, but they still are people performing a public service. So how are these public services disrupted? What are the meanings that we can sort of superimpose onto this type of disruption? And then I see some consequences and afterlives of these moments of clarity, of these disruptions, of these anxieties, and especially when we don't resolve those inequalities, when we don't allow people to be socially mobile, we're going to start seeing some really weird effects. And this was an image I took down in Kenosha just after the unrest that emerged after Jacob Blake was shot by a police officer in Kenosha. There was mass unrest in Kenosha, drew the attention of the whole world. One of the most striking images was a set of car dealerships that were burnt. And I went and took down a bunch of pictures. But when I went, I wasn't at the protests. I had to teach at the time. And so I never really had that time or availability to go down and protest late at night when all this stuff was happening. I ended up going on a weekend after the main events of the protests were done, after there was sort of a deadly interaction between two groups of protesters. One guy is sort of a militia guy. He's in jail right now, Kyle Rittenhouse. He was a 17-year-old boy, came up from Illinois, ended up shooting two protesters with a semi-automatic rifle, killing them, shot a third one who's still alive. Kyle Rittenhouse is going to be put up for homicide, 3 counts of homicide. 2 people lost their lives. And then we really see that this protest movement gets demonized because a lot of people are vandalizing things. When I was there was a bunch of middle-class suburban people taking selfies. And I thought it was just the most bizarre thing to see. And these people were almost there in protest of the protesters. They were almost counter-protesters. And you could hear these people murmuring about, this isn't protesting, this isn't democracy. If you want to talk, and I heard one guy say this, and he was like saying it to no one, but to everyone, and sort of people just making random statements that happen in any type of protest. Like, if you want to talk about bringing racial equality, this is one way that you're going to tear it down, right? And there's a white guy. All these people are white doing this too. It's like a very white counter protest, and almost like a form of tourism. And so what are these? These are some of the consequences of not resolving disruption, of the long-term effects of maybe one type of disruption leading to other types of collateral thinking, other types of collateral damage. And then I just want to say this is an image I took. This is the last image I took of my Spectra camera. This is at Carroll University. This is the lecture hall I teach in, and it is of the reckoning that I believe will come. And I was reading on Election Day 2020 a work by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he wrote in this essay about reparations, giving African-American communities more money and more resources based off of historical injustices. And beautiful essay, wonderful essay. And one of the lines that he writes is, what I'm talking about is more than recompense for past injuries, more than a handout, a payoff, hush money, or a reluctant bribe. What I'm talking about is a national reckoning that would lead to a spiritual renewal. And, I've mentioned this before in terms of Gen Z having a tough time. And I believe that you all are going to be the reckoning. You all will bring this spiritual renewal that we need. And you'll bring this based specifically off of all the difficulties that you will be having now in your life, based off of all this disruption from this problematic year, based off the disease, based off the social unrest, and based off of all the normal things that you could have had, and now they've become the new type of normal.